Hello, book people. This is my first time doing this, so it could be a total disaster, and I apologize in advance if it is. Just thought I would talk about some books that I love, and maybe a little bit later this year I can kind of go through some of the books I've read this year. I have a tendency, and I'm sure a lot of people do who are avid readers, where I'll read every day, and then all of a sudden I'll just kind of read a couple books a year, and then I'll go back to reading every day. So I have been on a really big reading kick since last summer, which I had kind of fallen into a slump, and so I started reading again, and now I'm flying through a lot of things, and so I'm trying to kind of stick to it. As an English major, so I'm supposed to be that book person, but I've always kind of been that one that was rather than going out or doing things, or even when I had to go out and do things, was the one in the corner with the book and, my nose buried in the book. So, anyway, that's kind of the overarching where I'm kind of looking to go. And, so this is my general, I want to say my favorites, but really, honestly, my favorite books change pretty much every day. So, obviously there's the classics, there's, the Shakespeare's and the Chaucers and Paradise Lost and all the literary stuff and poetry and things like that, but I'm going to try to just focus on 15 books I really enjoy. Maybe some variety, maybe some things you haven't heard of, maybe some things you have heard of, or, would like to revisit. So, yeah. So I'm going to start with some of the more classics. Jane Eyre. What I love about Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte is that it's not the kind of book you would think would be super entertaining. It's long, it's old, so it is a classic. But what I always find interesting about it is that a lot of the men I know, and, boys who aren't even really avid readers, or, obviously women too, who aren't avid readers, they'll pick it up and they love it. Everyone just loves it. So, I'm sure there are people who don't, but I find it so interesting how it can be so appealing across such a diverse readership. It's got kind of a little bit of everything. It has the romance, for the people who really like that old romance, but it has a little bit of creepiness. It's got a really neat mood. There's some possibly haunting, which turns into more of like a psychological and social commentary. And also Jane Eyre's just kind of a badass woman, and it's really cool to have such a cool heroine from such an old book, I guess. Another older book is Frankenstein, which sounds kind of cliche to be like, okay, Frankenstein's one of the best books of all time, but if you haven't read Frankenstein, or you've just seen the movie, or you read it back in the day and you just kind of haven't revisited, it's amazing. It's obviously, it has the horror element that everyone loves, and it kind of started the face of modern science fiction and horror. Also written by, a teenage girl, which is always impressive. And the thing about it is there's so many layers to it that I feel like every single time I read it, I come up with something new I love about it. And I have a new thought about something that happens in the book. And obviously it has a lot of that really fun kind of who's the real monster, a lot of psychological and philosophical pieces as well. And it's just a really good read. The vocabulary is, yes, it can be a little challenging, but I do think it tends to just be so interesting that you can kind of deal with that, and it's so great. And another classic, and then we're moving into more modern classics, The Great Gatsby. I know it's not always a lot of people's kind of thing. What I love about The Great Gatsby, not to mention how beautiful Fitzgerald's writing is, I just love how, it sounds funny, but I love how depressing it is. It's just so painful, and it really, I think, captures like nostalgia and that feeling of loss, and a lot of things that I don't think necessarily we target, we kind of talk about, or even really understand when we read that book in school. And so I think if that's one that you haven't read in a long time, definitely revisit it, because I think as we get older and we read something like Gatsby, it kind of connects to us in a different way. All the things that we wished we had done or should have done, and kind of Daisy Buchanan becomes sort of that face of the could have beens kind of in our lives. And then kind of the same time period, I love The Sun Also Rises. Again, I know it is very divisive. And I mean, Hemingway took a long time for me to get into. I always hated him. I had to read Old Man and the Sea when I was a kid because it was short and easy. And like everybody else, we have, there's not a lot that is relatable when you're in 7th grade, especially when you're like a 7th grade girl in like, the suburbs of New England, reading about, an old man fishing off the coast of Cuba. And, but I reread it and I revisited it lately, and I was just thinking how it has so much to it that I just don't think can be understood at a younger age. And really probably just because it's short doesn't mean we should be reading it, in middle school. But I read that, and then I read Farewell to Arms, which I thought was okay, but I thought it was a little too much on the romance. I'm not really a big romance reader. And so I just didn't like Hemingway very much. And then I read A Movable Feast, and I got really into like just him and his personality. And I know he's kind of a man's man, and, that's not really my thing, but I think he's so just interesting in his sort of like, there's so much darkness in that kind of, some of his anger, some of his depression that comes through in those things. And then when I read Sun Also Rises, I thought it just captured that so beautifully. And again, and a lot of people don't like to read to be depressed, but I really love sort of realistic. I do like a lot of dark fiction, so I love books that make you feel like there's somebody in the world who understands you, even if it's a long dead, author. But so one of the things I loved about Sun Also Rises is I just felt like my heart breaking when I finished it, and it felt so hopeless and sad and just kind of in a sickening way, but also in a really beautiful way. Just as that sense of loss and that sense of feeling, once you hit a certain point in your life of feeling like all the things that should have been and could have been and won't be anymore. So kind of similar to Gatsby in that. So again, that may not sound appealing to a lot of people, but that's just something that really resonates with me. Another classic, moving on to, I think our last sort of classic, is Catcher in the Rye. And again, we're talking about divisive, but Catcher in the Rye is the book that, saved my life. It's very cliche, yes, but it was the book that, defined me growing up. I read it, I think, in 6th or 7th grade, and it was one of those books that it just changed everything for me, because I was used to reading, what everybody else was reading, and I kind of always felt a little like, there was a certain way you had to think, and then there was me. And one of the things I loved about Catcher in the Rye is when I read it, I just felt so like, oh wow, there's this entire mindset and this way of thinking that I've had some of these thoughts and I didn't know other people did. And, I know that's kind of cliche to hear, but even now in my adult, life, when I revisit the book, I feel so connected to the character. And I know some people find him very whiny, and again, that's kind of a discussion point. But for me, I found him, I thought the way he dealt with loss, the way he dealt with growing up, and again, that theme that obviously is very popular for me is that like nostalgia and could have been, would have, should have been. So I still love Catcher in the Rye. It's still pretty much, it's going to always be in my top 3. Usually it's my favorite book. Sometimes it fluctuates, but it's always going to be in my top. And I've read it, over 100 times at this point. It's still one of my favorites. And then the last one is sort of a classic technically, but really it's more moving into genre fiction and more popular fiction. And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie. And Agatha Christie isn't always the easiest to read because obviously it's older. There's definitely some social things that, probably, I'm not a fan of editing books. I don't believe in, obviously I'm a fan of editing books, but I don't believe in going back and editing from the past. But you know, there are things that are certainly questionable that you read kind of now, and you're like, oh, I don't know if we should be saying those things. So sometimes shit can be kind of alienating, but the thing with And Then There Were None is it's just always going to be that mystery, that book that just gets you, you know. Sorry, my light is, I think, kind of going down. It's not too bad. So what I loved about And Then There Were None is I just never could have figured it out. It was brilliant. It was, you know, just so surprising. And no mystery has lived up to it since. And, you know, I'm still always looking for that. And I still love mysteries. And one of my favorite things is a group of people trapped on, you know, an island and getting killed off one by one. I love it in movies. I love it in books. And, you know, I think And Then There Were None started that. And again, I read that very young. And I read it again several times, even now, I still, like, when I get to the ending, I'm just like, damn, that was so good. You know, and it's just, I love getting caught where, you know, I can't figure it out. And to me, you know, I read so much mystery and I watch so many mysteries and horror movies, and I always feel like, oh, it's super obvious, you know, who did it. And when I can't figure it out, I'm just always super excited by that. So moving into my more sort of contemporary groups of books, my Stephen King, like, I grew up reading Stephen King, dating myself, but I'm in my 40s, and, you know, when we were growing up, there wasn't really much of a YA kind of world. So you sort of moved from being in the library, you went to the children's library and you read kids' books. And, you know, I read my Nancy Drew and, you know, Hardy Boys, which you can probably see in the picture, and all of my sort of kid books. But then when I kind of had read them all and, you know, I was in that, like, 6th grade kind of point, I wanted to read something a little more involved. And, you know, I was such an avid reader, and I was reading above grade level, and I was like, I need to read something that's a little more intense. And so that was my first sort of foray into adult fiction, was Stephen King. And I think that's probably the story of most people in their, you know, 30s, 40s, 50s. Like, most of us, that was like our first real kind of introduction into the big books, the long books, the bestsellers that weren't for kids. And so I've read a lot of his stuff. My husband's a huge Stephen King fan. I'm a Stephen King fan. You know, I'm not like, I haven't read everything of his. I don't feel like I need to read everything of his, but I do like, you know, some of the ones I've read. I think, and I really enjoyed The Shining. I really enjoyed Bag of Bones. I liked, I love Needful Things. But I think my favorite is Pet Sematary. And my reason for that is just simply that I think it's the one that scared me the most. I remember reading it, and it was a sunny day in the summer, and midday, and I was in my room, and I just was so scared reading it that I had to go outside and just, like, try to, like, be around, like, nature and or something, because I just couldn't. I was so afraid. I was, like, looking over my shoulder in my house, and it's like this beautiful sunny day, and the birds are chirping, and I'm still terrified. And to me, a book that's that scary is just going to stick with me. I don't know if it would scare me the same way now. Maybe it was the day, maybe it was my mood, but it just really terrified me, and I like that. So, yeah, that's my Stephen King. And then, so moving into our more, well, I guess moving kind of from there, I'm cheating a bit, but I have sort of, instead of one book, I'm going to say vintage, like, teen horror. I love Christopher Pike. I love the Fear Street books. I love all those point horror books. I know they're super cheesy. I reread them now. I don't care. They're so much fun. I'm trying to build my collection. You may see some of them. I have a lot of them. And again, that was it. That was really one of the few things we had that was that crossover for us as, you know, readers. And I just loved it because, you know, it was about teenagers, but it was all creepy and all these, like, horrible things were happening, and, you know, there were murder mysteries, and there were, you know, some supernatural elements and ghosts, but it was all happening to teenagers who were dealing with, like, normal teenage things. And you know, I think it's kind of like for people who liked Goosebumps and Spooksville and those sort of like the kids version. I never read those because I was too old at that point to be really reading those. But these were sort of the teen version, and they just really were fun because they were all the things I liked, but they were also like relevant because they were dealing with, you know, like also having to do homework while, you know, you're being haunted, and so, or, you know, going to a party and like your friend is mad at you. It's just the things that you're dealing with as a teenager. And I don't know if you caught the Fear Street movie series on Netflix, but it was fantastic. It was everything I wanted. I hope they make 55 more. I loved it. I thought it did a really good job too of like not just copying the books and having like its own stories. And so that was kind of cool, but also having some Easter eggs for those of us who'd read them. I also really enjoyed actually the Goosebumps movies, but you know, those are different. And I haven't watched the Midnight Club on Netflix, which is based on Christopher Pike, and so I really need to because I just love him. So, all right, so moving into contemporary and, you know, more adult fiction, I suppose. I would say Book Thief, which is kind of another crossover because technically it's considered like a children's or YA book, but it's long and it deals with the Holocaust and it's kind of dark, and also it's so beautifully written that I can't imagine how you could, you know, sometimes people write it off as like, oh, it's just for kids. It's so beautiful. I mean, on a side note, his Dark Materials, if you're looking for something that people write off as just for kids, I don't, you know, that his Dark Materials by Philip Pullman is fantastic. Not on my list today because I forgot. But yeah, Book Thief, what I loved about the Book Thief is that I was like 4 pages in and I was just like, okay, I am in love with words again. Like this, the writing, it's just fantastic. I wish I had a copy in front of me. I'll probably post a quote on the video so you can just see like the opening lines. It's just so beautifully written. And I like instantaneously fell in love with it. And, you know, I mean, we've read and seen a million things about the Holocaust, but it's just the way it's written. It's just beautiful. It's narrated by Death, which I think is just such a unique perspective, but it's not just a gimmick. It is beautifully written and definitely deserves the hype it gets. Then I have Neil Gaiman's Neverwhere, which is kind of, for those who don't know, it's sort of like a dark Alice in Wonderland. You have these people who basically this regular guy in London, and he discovers there's this whole underworld, you know, underground society. It's fantasy. I'm not a huge fantasy person. I do love the Song of Ice and Fire series, which again hasn't made my list because I forgot. But Neverwhere is just, it's so much fun. And the characters are so great. Anybody who's read Neil Gaiman, he has such a unique style of writing. And he's fun, but also really, you know, like, he gets everything. He kind of just can hit it all. You know, he can hit the mysterious side and be funny, but also be, you know, serious enough. It's not so funny that it becomes kind of camp. So he just does it really well. You may have read Good Omens, which he co-wrote with Terry Pratchett, or seen the movie. The Sandman series, which I also haven't finished on Netflix, and I love the comics, so I'm not really sure what I'm doing. I guess I'm wasting too much time reading and not watching enough Netflix. All right, so moving from there, the Thursday Murder Club series, these are just really fun. I'm not generally a cozy mystery kind of person. I like dark. I like, you know, sort of more, I don't want to say violent, but just more dark overall when it comes to mysteries and thrillers. But they're so funny. And they're just, the characters are so endearing. And you can, you know, they're cozy, but also with like a legitimate crime going on. So it's not like too cutesy. Like there's some pretty awful stuff happening, but the characters are just fun. Because, I don't know, maybe it's just because it's a group of elderly people, but, and I don't know, maybe it's also for me as an American. I think I have like a thing for, you know, that kind of British style of writing and British comedy. And so, I don't know, maybe that's part of it too. It's got kind of that British feel to it. And then, in the same sort of realm, I have It Girl, which is the most recent book I read by Ruth Ware, but honestly, I love everything she writes. She writes such interesting mysteries, very deep kind of character studies, but also thrillers and mysteries, and I think she does a really good job of giving you interesting characters and, giving you that standard sort of anyone could have done it, because they all have their sort of reasons, they all have their secrets, but they're really fleshed out characters. They don't feel tropey. They feel like people you could actually know. And even like the worst people in her book seem sort of also likable in a weird way. So I do enjoy her stuff. I mean, obviously, except for so she has a few that I would say are just probably sociopaths. But, the normal sort of regular characters, even when they're kind of like jerks in parts, they're still sort of likable people because they feel real. And then moving into likable but awful people, Gone Girl. I love Gillian Flynn. I just think she does such a good job of writing women who are awful, and I think it's so wonderful and so feminist to be like, hey, women can also be awful and horrible. So I'm a huge fan of hers. But I love Gone Girl because, and this is probably dark, but I think Amy is fantastic. She's awful. She's a horrible human being. I'm not saying I want to go out and live like her and do the things she's done, but it's just so brilliant. And, you're kind of hate her, but also you have to respect her. And then I think my last two are just books that I really, really love. So, The Last House on Needless Street, I loved it. I absolutely fell in love with this book. This was the first book, I think, since, maybe second book, but since The Book Thief, in like a decade ago, that I just kind of made me fall in love with language, fall in love with books again. I enjoy reading, but it's just her, Catching on a Word, I think that's how you say it. Her writing is gorgeous, and I mean, there's a whole section narrated by a cat. I mean, you can't do better than that. The cat is fantastic. I mean, I guess, fair warning, I didn't remember, but apparently there's some, animals dying at the beginning of the book. Definitely stick it out, because there's awful things happen to animals, awful things happen to people, but there's just a really beautiful story in there, even though, awful things are happening. It's still such a great story, and it's kind of sad. I mean, it's psychological, it's creepy, but it's also really sad. And speaking of that, I think my current favorite writer is Ian Reid. When I read him Thinking of Ending Things, I couldn't put it down. I read it in a few hours. I just needed to keep going. The mood is phenomenal. It's creepy. It just feels unsettling. Something just feels wrong the whole time you're reading it. Everything about it, it just feels uncomfortable. But then the ending it's like getting stabbed in the heart. It's so good, and it's just so strong of an ending, and it changes everything you've been thinking, and everything as you're reading, you're thinking, oh, this is creepy, are these people, and you kind of don't like them. But the ending, I mean, it was one of those books that I just kind of needed to sit for hours in quiet and just process. The movie is pretty good. I think the adaptation did a good job, but I do feel like it does a really good job if you've read the book, because I'm not sure that, I just don't think anything can capture it the way that a book does. And that's common, but this is one of those books that I just think needs to be read. I don't know that other media can really capture it the same way. So definitely check that book out. Read it. It's gorgeous. And then I just read We Spread, which is his newer one, and same thing. It feels unsettling. Something feels off. It feels like he has this thing where it feels like horror, and then you get to this end and you realize, I'm not going to spoil it, but it's kind of horror, but it's also kind of just literary fiction, human fiction, psychology. He just, obviously I don't know his personal life or his situation, but he gets people, and he gets older people, and he gets the way people think. And I kind of wish he, like, wrote everything in the world, but then, you know, that would be a lot of Ian Reid. And I think he probably doesn't have time to write everything in the world, and I also feel like it would become saturated, and I wouldn't appreciate how beautiful his writing and his storytelling is. So, yeah, so those are some of my favorite books, and let me know what you think. Let me know if you read any of them, if you have any interest in reading of any of them. And this is probably pretty rambly, and I apologize, but hopefully I'll be better at it in the future. All right, thank you. Bye.